just wait another minute or two as people come in. Fantastic. We had an earlier session today to launch the book on for European lunch hour time, and had a great participation. And we're hoping that this hour will also bring in another crowd. And we realized a little bit late that there's been daylight savings times. There might have been a little bit of confusion over the time, but hopefully not too much. Okay, wonderful, great.
Hi, Angie.
Dagmar.
Another author joined us. Angie, hi. Warm welcome.
Bjorn, excellent. Okay, fantastic. Welcome. Great. Well, maybe we can begin, Cordula, and then other people will join as they arrive. So thank you so much to everyone for coming to our book launch today. This has been a long process, a much anticipated one. Cordula and I and the many authors who have contributed from around the world to this volume are overjoyed, really, to see this initiative, this project and collaboration coming to fruition finally. Hi, Jenny from Lebanon, who's also one of our contributors. I see her there as well. We'll do a short round of introductions, and then we will have a little bit of an exchange around how the book came to be, what it brings to the conversation around trauma-informed practice, in particular in areas of conflict, crisis, and peace building. And then we'll have an opportunity for some dialogue and exchange among the people in the room as well, before sharing then more information about how to access the book and giving you a sneak peek at the book with a free sample from the book as well, and talking about how we'll follow up with possible future collaborations and other sorts of ways to connect to the work that you are doing and that other organizations are doing in this important field. So my name is CLARKE-HABIBI. I'm one of the co-editors of the volume with my friend and colleague Cordula Reimann. And we see in the room Barry Hart, who has generously written the preface to the volume as well, and more especially, it was Barry's publication on peacebuilding in traumatized societies in 2008, which really, for the first time, articulated in a meaningful way the importance of having a trauma-informed perspective on engaging in peacebuilding contexts. And it was building on this landmark work of Barry that we thought, okay, almost 20 years later, where has the field come to? What have we learned in that interval of time? How have we grown in our understanding of peacebuilding and of trauma itself? And so we were really honored to have Barry write the preface to the volume, and so happy that you could make it today to join us in this launch event. I'll pass over to you, Cordula. And please continue introducing yourselves in the chat as you enter into the space. We'd love to know who's here with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from me. My name is Cordula. I'm the other co-editor, surprise, surprise, and I'm very happy to be connected with all of you tonight. I feel, that's already what I shared earlier today, when I was asked yesterday how actually was that kind of book editing process, how was this writing of the chapters for over now 3 years, and I compared it to being pregnant, but not for 9 months, but for nearly 3 years. So you can imagine it was really heavy labor, and as with every pregnancies, at least it takes 2 people, but in many pregnancies, especially giving birth, it takes more people. And I think that is where our beautiful, wonderful people, contributors, authors are coming in, and all the support system Sarah and I had in these 3 years. So right from the start, I want to say really big thank you to all the authors, all the contributors, all the people who made that happen, this piece of work. So wonderful to be connected with all of you. And some of you may wonder, why did Sarah and I actually start writing the book, had the idea of maybe editing a book on trauma responsive peacebuilding? So Sarah, I want to ask you, what was actually your or our motivation to do so?
Thanks, Cordula. So for me personally, the idea came more than 10 years ago. My own work in the area of peace building began in post-war Bosnia and Herzegovina in the very early 2000 in fact, 1999, 2000, which was shortly after the war. And for those of us who've worked in the area of peace building that long, you would know that trauma was nowhere in the conversation. It was about democracy and human rights and rule of law and economic development. I even had experts tell me that this belongs in psychology. It has nothing to do with peace. I mean, it's unbelievable now to think that that was the response, but it really didn't fit within the peace building discourse or frameworks. And that's why I'm so grateful to people like Barry and others who, like my own instinct at that time, felt surely something is missing and something significant. There's no way that we can have meaningful engagement with peace building without actually looking at the human costs of violent conflict and war. It's just impossible to think about it. And so I had been wanting to write something based on that experience. But then I also felt many dilemmas, as I'm sure all of us do, which is that how do you address this topic? It's so complex. It has so many facets. Every context is different. There are individual dimensions of trauma and collective dimensions of trauma. There are political and structural dimensions. There are the psychological and social psychological dimensions. And I thought, this is not a one-person task. This has to be a collective effort. We have to together. And I looked around, and Cordula was a natural partner because Cordula has been engaged in these topics as well, especially on collective trauma, for so many years, and we just clicked. We've never actually met in person, if you can believe it. It was a meeting of hearts and minds. It was a one conversation that said, yes, this has to be done. We have to do it. It has to happen now. And then the rest of it unfolded with the generous and brave participation of all of the people who contributed to the volume. And that, I must say, was not an easy process either, but we'll get a little bit more into the details. But what I wanted to just mention is that, of course, in the intervening years, the whole agenda around mental health and psychosocial support suddenly appeared on the radar and became a legitimate thing in the space, first of humanitarian engagement, but then increasingly in related fields of longer term development and peace building and even security. And so here as well, Cordula and I, we knew that having a comprehensive volume was what we felt would give justice to this rich and complex topic. But it was also a trade-off in a way, because it's not an agile mode of publication. Writing up a project report and sharing it as a PDF document is a much faster way to communicate. So there have been some trade-offs, and also there have been some lovely developments. We've seen so many different organizations, even sectors, engage in the notion of MHPSS and how it needs to be accounted for and operationalized. And yet with this volume, we also wanted to extend that field by connecting with important work that has been done now for many decades in the wider space of trauma, intergenerational and collective trauma. So a whole body of work exists now for decades in psychology and social psychology. Peace building and security was in a different space. We wanted to bring these together. And in this volume, we address the mental health components in a shorter term crisis and conflict context. And we also extend into those deeper intergenerational, collective, structural legacies of trauma that have a great importance for the wider work of conflict transformation and sustainable peace building. So Cordula, and I'm going to also ask our authors who are here today as well to give your own responses in the chat as we go through this mini interview flyover of the volume. But I'll ask you, Cordula, now that we've gotten to this stage of really being able to launch the book through all of the hard work and collaboration that it represents, what are you most proud of? And what for you does this, the existence of this volume, what for you does it represent? And feel free to our chapter contributors as well to give your own response to that.
Well, I mean, maybe if you allow me to stay with the metaphor of the pregnancy, I'm first of all very proud that the baby is coming out, is out, and is quite healthy, as far as I can tell. So I'm really happy that we made it because during the last 3 years, with the genocide in Gaza, with the escalation of violence in Sudan and other countries. I think it was very difficult, not only for our contributors to stay engaged, but also to really put our heart and mind to the topic, while also maybe dealing with our own different levels of stress when we think of the different contexts which directly affects many of our contributors. So that's more on a sort of personal level, but in terms of looking at the book and what I'm particularly grateful for, maybe more than anything else, is that I think we were lucky enough to have this amazing set of people, group of people, the authors coming from a very diverse background. I think we have a variety of very different perspectives, backgrounds, and disciplines. And that, in a way, we were lucky enough to have also a very nice geographical range covered from Canada, United States, Colombia, Germany, Bosnia, Ukraine, Nepal, Kashmir, Korea, South Africa, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, Central African Republic, Sudan, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Palestine, and Iraq, and Northern Ireland. So there, I think I'm again very, very grateful and proud that we were able to have these diverse opinions and diverse perspective from these different regions. And maybe another feature of our book or of our contribution, which I think I'm particularly grateful for, is that we actually try with this book to bridge different disciplines and practices and moving beyond this silo thinking, which we still have in many of our disciplines. And having read, and many of you who have been involved in editing books, writing books, know maybe what I'm talking about. When you read and reread in the very final stages of the book publication, the book again and again. And I think what we really where I think we're really good at is trying to bringing together these different, very inspiring conceptual ideas, empirical research, very different methods. So when you think of randomized control trials to embodied approaches, working, for instance, with breath work, working with different somatic experience method, working with dancing, working with different arts-based approaches. So we have quite a variety of different approaches to policy analysis and case studies written up by practitioners. So these are maybe some of the points I'm particularly grateful for. So I already now touched a couple of times on some of the case studies, and that of course begs the question. Now I'm asking you again, Sarah. What is actually the main content of the book? What are we actually talking about in terms of chapters and in terms of different contributions?
Thank you so much. Yeah, Cordula, I'm just going to put in the chat. You probably have seen it already, but I'll put there the link to the publishing page where you'll see the table of contents, and I'll just share it here. We won't go, of course, into a lot of detail just at the moment. Sorry, I will just close one of these so that I have a better view. But I think it's helpful to know sort of the shape of the book, and hopefully you can see we'll talk about access and price later, but the book is structured around 5 key sections, which we felt were important to create a common language around this complex and growing field. There is some consensus, but there is still some debate and a broadening of the terms that we're using, and we wanted to capture a little bit the state of the art and also signal new horizons. But given that the different disciplines that we were trying to address, humanitarian development, peace building actors, which includes human rights lawyers, which includes people from disciplines which maybe haven't had a lot of engagement with psychological and social psychological phenomenon, we felt it was important to lay the groundwork. So part one of the book explores what is it that we actually know about the nature of individual and collective trauma in the specific relationship to violent conflict and efforts at peace building. So there are many, of course, different angles from which we can look at the notion of trauma, and there are many different types of trauma, but we wanted to explore it in this way. And that first part of the book offers a combination of a sort of state-of-the-art and theoretical elaborations on the causes and effects of individual and collective violence and what can lead to what can be traumagenic events and the nature and dynamics of trauma itself, how it expresses itself at the individual and collective levels, and how in particular it can feed into cycles of conflict and violence. We see here, for example, chapters from Cordula on the interactions between trauma and conflict and peace building, from our friend and contributor Suzanne, who's here today, in the collective expression of trauma legacies in collective narratives, how trauma can shape collective identities. That's extending the work of Cordula as well and others who have worked in the field. Collective identities, collective narratives, collective emotions, collective worldviews, how we approach the notion of in-groups and out-groups, and how we narrate our stories as peoples, as societies, and potential to transform trauma narratives for healing, for peace building, for reconciliation. And that takes us in this section to some case studies, most particularly in the context of Israel, where we have intergenerational dynamics of trauma from the history and geography of this space, but also interactions with more recent dynamics and changes. And this is one of the kind of the key messages that comes through in the volume, which is that we can take snapshots, but in reality, trauma, society, narratives, identities, they're constantly in flux. They're dynamic, they're evolving. There are always extra factors that shape what is happening, and can undo and can support peace building processes. So that's interesting to look. We see also here in this chapter from Nurit Schnabel, and this is another aspect of the book which I think is unique still in this space, which is looking more especially at interactions between victims and perpetrators of violence. Of course, a lot of work has been done on this, but it hasn't so much entered into the peace building space. The peace building space and humanitarian space is still largely victim-centered. And when we want to advance meaningful and deep and sustainable peace building, we need to think about what are the wounds of violence on all sides of the violence, on those who commit violence and on those who are victims of violence. And of course, it's not black and white. There is a lot of nuance and shades of gray. But what are the different needs that result from these different sides of the equation, and what are the implications then for practice? And also, how do we link trauma with other notions of injustice, justice, resilience, and peace building, which carries us into part two of the book. Part two of the book then takes us to the next step, which is what potential and promise and what openings are there for resilience and healing as a foundation for peace building. So we look at some of the theoretical framings of resilience and healing, and then we go straight into a number of case studies which explore a range of methodologies for fostering resilience and healing in relation to the body, in relation to person-to-person interactions, using different techniques such as arts, such as theater, such as dialogue, of course, talk-based approaches, but also community-level engagement, dynamics with resilience and healing in the shorter and the longer term. So we have some case studies here from Korea, from the Beslan tragedy, from Israel and Palestine. Eva is with us today as well. Katie, Catherine Mansfield is here with us as well today, and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in programs of education. So looking at resilience and healing through these different lenses. We then move in part 3 to a more specific focus on the shorter term engagement in crisis affected settings on the mental health and psychosocial support lens and approach, or approaches. That's the MHPSS engagement, which has gathered a lot of momentum in the last 10 years, especially. And here we have these mental health and psychosocial support case studies in places of active conflict and crisis, notably Ukraine, northern Syria, Afghanistan, Central African Republic. And across those case studies, again, we're exploring different tools and methods, playback theater, education, psychosocial community support, gender-sensitive support, hypnoneuro techniques, imagination techniques, and facilitation processes that can be mindful of well-being, elements of well-being and trauma-informed practice in different contexts. I'll pause here to say that, and sorry as well, not to miss it, how not only we apply a trauma-informed lens to working with others, but also how we apply a trauma-informed lens to being mindful of our own well-being as practitioners and integrating a duty of care into our organizations. And I pause there to mention that one of the tools that Cordula and I used to frame the volume is a trauma-informed spectrum, which helps organizations and practitioners situate their practice along a continuum of focus, from no focus or little focus to a framing but a non-explicit engagement with trauma to a much more explicit and centered framing as the primary agenda. And this is important because we don't always call trauma-informed work by the name of trauma. There are ways that, because of contextual sensitivities or the primary focus of a particular invention, we may not be naming it, but bringing that awareness is important. In the fourth part of the book, we then move from the short term into the longer term, intergenerational, collective, historical, structural aspects of trauma and its legacies, and approaches to peace building and conflict transformation. So here in this part, we tap into existing bodies of work and more recent case studies around dealing with the past, dealing with collective memory, dealing with collective narratives, transforming education systems, transforming friend-enemy images, engaging in reparations for gross human rights violations. And we've got fascinating case studies from practitioners in Lebanon, Syria, the Caucasus, in Nepal and Iraq, Colombia, Rwanda, Kenya, and also working with different populations, youth peace builders, women, communities, victims and perpetrators. So this is also a very rich section, and probably the contribution of the book that extends beyond the current state of MHPSS engagement, which we hope will be taken up more and more in the years ahead as we realize the long-term effects of trauma. Finally, but certainly not least, part 5 is the critical self-reflexive part of the book, which we do also try to integrate throughout, but it's where we try to deconstruct and also decolonize. What do we actually mean when we're talking about trauma and peace building practice? Who gets to decide what trauma is and how it's defined? Who gets to decide what are appropriate ways to deal with it? What is the right relationship between trauma and peace building in different contexts? And also, where do we, in our own positionality, fit into this picture? What assumptions are we coming with that need to be broken down? What positionalities do we bring? And so here we have rich contributions as well that critique the very notions that we're working with and that reframe them in radically different ways and call for this radical reformulation. And then, of course, the book ends with some of our reflections as co-editors on the future directions of the field. So I hope that gives you a view of the narrative arc of the book, and you can explore further. And we will give you at the end of this session the opening chapter, preface and introduction to the volume, which will go a little bit more into how we explore those themes together. But coming back to you, Cordula, this enormous landscape that we've tried to cover, maybe you can also tell us about some of the choices, not always easy choices we had to make, and also in putting together this particular collection, and also what out of this collection comes as some of the key takeaways that readers can expect as they dive into the volume.
Yeah, as you can imagine, Sarah was already talking about the wide landscape which we try to cover. So there are quite a few, I would say, messages maybe to take away. And given the time we're having here together tonight, this morning, I would like to focus on three. For me, the first one is, and I think having read again through all the chapters, I think many of them speak to them while to different degrees. The first one for me is that trauma dynamics are key causes, drivers, and effects of violent conflict. And particularly unresolved trauma, especially collective intergenerational trauma, can fuel cycles of violence, shame, fear, mistrust, guilt, and what we may want to call revenge narratives. And they make sustainable peace difficult to achieve. When you think of the first chapters in the first part by Sarah, me, and by Eva, who is with us tonight or this morning, her work, for instance, focusing on transgenerational collective trauma in the context of Israel-Palestine, very fascinating case study. Equally fascinating case study, the work being done by Jenny and Soher and all the partner organizations they're working with in Lebanon, trying to take the notion, the concept of collective trauma and try to really put it into practice. Very fascinating. So the first takeaway message, that trauma dynamics are key causes, drivers, and effects of violent conflict. And that message needs to be clearly heard and understood by policymakers and practitioners alike. And that brings me to the second message, that I think peace building as a discipline, or if you prefer to call it field of practice, and we as peace builders, I think we have to be trauma aware if we want to be effective. And I would argue, or we argue in the book, Sarah and I, as do many of our authors do as well, that trauma awareness is in a way an ethical, political, and strategic imperative. And we try, particularly in the last chapter, to argue that trauma awareness doesn't only enhance the effectiveness of our work, but really prevents re-traumatization, enables and supports genuine intra-party and inter-party reconciliation and systemic justice-oriented change. So that's maybe the lesson number 2. And lesson number 3, Sarah already touched upon it, particular in part 5, we highlight the need for more reflexivity, for more positionality in the peace building fields. And we understand that book as a more or less gentle invitation to really take more time and space for us as practitioners to reflect and to engage more vigorously, maybe than we have done in the past, in self-reflection. And that for us also includes maybe the more demanding questions like, why do I do what I do? Why do I engage in topics of conflict and peace? Do they have something to do with my own, maybe family, a system I'm coming from? Am I projecting, transferring some of my personal, maybe unsolved trauma or problems to the macro level? Do I know how to deal with my own triggers? Do I have a clear idea what these triggers are and where they come from, and how maybe sometimes I'm, um, you know, use them, work with them, not necessarily always in a trauma sensitive way. So this kind of self-reflection we think is needed. What I think is maybe also needed more than maybe we have been willing to admit in the past is an emotional awareness of self-regulation. I like to say that first regulate, then relate. How often do we engage in dialogue or relate to others without actually ensuring that we're taking care of our own self-regulation? And it also implies, of course, an ethical engagement and recognizing always and time and again that our own positionality and biases, which we all have when working in conflict context, matter, and we have to be very, very sensitive to them. And then in that context, I think the decolonizing critique of trauma and peace building practices is essential. I think maybe far too long Western biomedical and very often very individualistic models of trauma have far too long been dominating the discussion and also marginalized very often indigenous and maybe more relational and spiritual healing traditions. And here in particular, happy also again to refer to the work of our colleagues from Canada, but also from the work being done by EFA and others. So that in a way are, among many others, my sort of main takeaways or the main messages. Looking at the time flies when you're having fun. Looking at the time and knowing that maybe some of you are very keen to ask questions. You have been so patiently listening with an open heart and a big heart and an open mind. So we would like to now give you the space to ask questions maybe related to some of particular chapters. We would like to really make use of our wonderful authors, which are with here tonight or this morning, to also give them the space and the floor to share a little bit more of their important work. Questions regarding some maybe the arguments put forward by SARA or myself, or do you have any specific questions on some of the authors' contribution? The floor
And
is
comments
yours.
as well.
And
Feel
comments
free
as well.
to raise your hand or also to put in the chat. Elaine?
Having published a couple of books myself and been through that pregnancy birthing process, I have a particular my own response to finishing works is a sense of relief. People say, "Oh, it's an accomplishment." No, it's more a sense of relief getting things. I would like to hear from authors how you feel when you finally have expressed what you needed to express in your chapter.
Thank you.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in because the first thing that came to my mind, Elaine, is how bizarre the whole process is that you've actually written this thing 2 to 3 years ago that is now finally showing up in print. And for me, it's almost like the bubbling question that is in response to either relief or the discomfort that was mentioned at the opening of this call, because the new wars keep coming, is just how do we keep this conversation very alive and active and vibrant? And, you know, does each one of us start a podcast in our own place? Do some of the authors decide to have a series together where we're in conversation with people? Because for me, part of this process was connecting with this body of people who are all really trying to give care to something that had been neglected, as we try to diminish the violence in the world. So just a big thanks to everyone who did this. And to your question, for me, it's almost like, okay, it's great that we express that stuff. And how do we keep it alive, and how do we keep the conversations going so that more people can feel themselves transforming the experiences they've been through? And I'll pass to Kate, whose hand is up.
Thank you, Katie.
Yeah, thank you all. Hello, this looks like a wonderful collection, and what strikes me even from the chapter titles, as well as a couple of reflections in the chat box, is that you're putting frameworks to things we've long been thinking about, but you're now expressly articulating them. And I loved Katie Mansfield's description of healthy power, because it sounds very empowering in many regards. And I wondered if Katie, and also if her colleague is here today, could say a little bit more about what you mean by healthy power in this context. Thank you.
Katie, directly a question to you. You want to answer?
I'm happy to answer. I would also invite my dear Hyojin, who is here, but I think Hyojin may be nursing her actual 6-month-old baby. So maybe it's not convenient for her to unmute. So it's good to have Hyojin and June here. And Hyojin, I'm going to take a breath just in case you want to chime in. But I would say, there's the breath. And no, okay. So healthy power, I mean, one of the ways we talk about this is power together and power within rather than power over. And, for too much of the world, the sort of teachings of power related to domination. And what so many communities, especially Indigenous communities, and in this context, Black communities have shared with me is like, actually, it's about collective power, and it's about building power together and building power within both communities and within individual bodies to resist the forces that say that domination is the only form of power. So that would be a short-ish answer. Thanks, Kate.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that question, and thank you for that response. And please take a look in the chat. Thank you to several of our authors there who have also described a kind of summarized a part of the essence of their chapters. Susanne and Eva. Katie, of course, had shared 2 of her chapters. Any other questions or comments? And also, Barry, if you'd like to say anything, or anyone else in the room, if you'd like to raise a question or a comment, feel welcome. Maybe while people are formulating their thoughts, one of the things that I wanted to share about what the book also provides is a conceptualization of trauma as not just psychological. It's structural, it's political, it's politicized, it's instrumentalized. Trauma is also, it's used as a tool for political leverage, for staking a claim. But it's also something over which we may not be entirely aware how it's functioning in ourselves, in our communities, in the ways that our institutions work. So what the book tries to do is to give a vocabulary and give a lens or several lenses to understand how do we recognize the presence of trauma and its impacts on the way that we perceive, feel, communicate, relate, plan, work, transform our societies. What assumptions does it shape for us about the keys to peace building? And when do we notice that things are getting stuck? And it's the stuckness that is one of the greatest indicators that some work somewhere needs to be done in ourselves and in our communities and in our institutions. We're getting stuck. We're turning in circles. We're using formulas that don't produce the change or transformation that we're seeking. So how can we open up those spaces of reflection and look at what might be underlying it? And I think that as you go through the volume, you find many tools, many indicators, many shorthand what's the right word? Again, entry points that help us to engage in that space, all the while recognizing that you can't just walk into a meeting on Monday and say, okay, let's talk about trauma. There's subtlety, there's science, and there's art to the process of opening spaces. And when I talk about opening, it is really about approaching places of wounding and being mindful of what are the conditions that make it safe to open up deep, sometimes conscious and sometimes less conscious places of hurt, with the aim of not passing over, not forgetting, but working with, engaging with, working through, growing from, building upon. But let me turn over again. Yes, I see a hand up there, Marianne.
Mom, you're still muted.
How are you marketing this book so that it does in fact reach the people and places and institutions that need to see it, need to hear it, and need to be involved and actively take into practice what in fact you are trying to communicate?
Thank you. That is, of course, a key question in terms of, getting the message out to the right people. Today is a big day for celebration for SARA and me, but of course we have been already planning how to market that book for a long time. And we work a lot with opportunities. SARA and I have a rather, I would say, wide network of peacebuilding practitioners, organizations, colleagues from foreign ministries working for different international organizations. And what we're dreaming of is that we will have different workshops, meetings, talks with all these different people. We have to see what is realistic, what is feasible. We also there again would like to stress that all our authors have equally strong and wide networks, and we really would like to pull all these different networks together and see actually what is doable, especially in this current moment. We are talking while we have the war being waged in the Middle East, we still have the genocide going on in Gaza. We have many forgotten conflicts we're not talking about. We have polarization in our own societies. And I think maybe also to remind us again that while we talk a lot about peace building is happening somewhere else, it was particular, for instance, Katie's chapter reminding us that it's actually needed right in front of our doorstep. And I think that we also want to understand the book as a contribution to working on depolarization and working on the conflicts which we basically have in our own societies. So thank you. And we are very happy and open to actually take on board other marketing ideas some of you may have. So very happy to be in contact with some of you if you have some ideas and we haven't thought about them.
On that, I'm just sharing in the chat some of the questions around access. So you and we were also shocked at the price of the volume. And I just want to say one little word on that. Number one, we didn't know that it would be so expensive when we started this initiative. That was then a dilemma, because of course it's completely contradictory to the whole effort to produce something which is not accessible. One of the things which is, again, a bit of a reflection and a trade-off in the publishing world is a large 500-page print volume through an international publishing house with all of its global diffusion and reach is a different beast than writing up a project report and diffusing it by email as a PDF file. It's a completely different undertaking. And so there are some naturally higher costs involved in producing that type of volume. It's slower, it's more expensive. On the other hand, it stakes a place in the field that will become a point of reference for 10, 20, and 30 years ahead. It's going to remain more perhaps than a project report that was submitted by email. So there are trade-offs. One of them, though, is a question of access. So how do we get access to the volume? First of all, academic institutions are privileged in a volume like this because many academic institutions have institutional subscriptions and libraries that will automatically get access. Please check with your institutions if you have access to them. And if you don't have an institutional or the institution hasn't subscribed to this publication, encourage it because one institution's access gives hundreds, thousands of people access to the volume. And the cost for an institution of $200 or $300 versus the cost to an individual is proportionally, it's much better. So we do hope that as many institutions as possible will purchase the volume to enable access. Our aim, as Cordula was mentioning, is to have fully open access. And fully open access requires funds. And that's tricky for us because most of the contributors to the volume are practitioners who don't have necessarily institutional budgets for open access. So we're trying now to crowdfund open access, which would get unlimited universal access to the volume. And if you have ideas or if you're willing to contribute to crowdfunding with us for open access, open access for the whole volume would be about £15,000. Open access for a chapter would be about 1,000 or so. And this is, of course, again, the nature of this type of publishing. And we've learned a lot in the process. If you were to ask Cordula and I, would we do it this way again? Probably the answer would be no. But it has been done this way now, and it still has benefits. I'm going to put here in the chat as well a discount for the volume. Which for those who would like to get individual or institutional copies, I hope this works. This should give you access to the discount code. And if it doesn't work, we'll find another way to share it. Routledge has a price drop after the first year of publication. So in all cases, the price will come down, and that will be on print and ebook versions. For authors, of course, have access to their chapters and to an ebook version of the book. And you would be surprised at the restrictions that we have even on sharing individual chapters, but preprint versions may be used in some cases. I'm also going to share with you immediately, because we're coming up a little bit to the end of our time. I'm going to share in the chat as well the link to the opening sections of the book. That includes the table of contents, the foreword by Barry Hart, the preface by Cordula and myself, and the introductory chapter, which goes a little bit more into detail into how the book is approached. While the book was initiated 2.5 years ago, and some of the chapters relate to work that was being done at that time, I do want to emphasize, though, that it's not out of date, mostly because the editing process has been going on for quite a long time and chapters have been updated in the process, but also the front and back ends of the book were brought up to speed in relation to current conflicts. So it's not out of date by any means. And many of the tools and takeaways and initiatives described in the book are ongoing. Any other questions on access issues? No access, or is access request wanted? Is there a problem to access the links that I gave? Yes?
The first one.
The first one isn't working? Okay, I'll try to fix that. And maybe Cordula, you can see if there are other questions or comments while I try to figure that out.
Yes. Any other questions? Any of our authors who maybe also want share a particular insight with all of us from their respective case studies? Please, Stephen.
I mentioned this in the earlier session that we had, but many of you here may be interested in your line of work in hosting some of the authors, or there's 5 sections. Some of those sections might be of interest to your organization. I think I'm myself and some others are looking at some crowd funding sort of opportunities to get this open access. So we're going to be playing around with that, maybe letting a year pass. We don't know quite yet if it's a substantial drop or whatever, but we are wanting to find opportunities. And the authors and SARA and Cordula, when we met earlier in the week, are looking at opportunities to get this open access, because it really needs to be open access. And so how do we do that in a manner that is quick and expedited, but also, fair to everyone who participated in this. So, I think in the future, beyond just these kind of two events, we would love to see other sort of events organized, and maybe some of the authors will be organizing some sessions in the future and combining that maybe with little crowd funding sort of opportunities. So it is a lot of money, but I think when you collectively bring everyone who's engaged in this, I think it's definitely doable in the next year or so.
I also want to tag in. Sorry.
No, thank you, Stephen. I just want to sort of second what Stephen just said. I mean, basically, we're talking 500, 600 pounds per author. And some of us may not be able to pay that, but others might be able to afford to pay that. And I think I also would like to encourage the whole idea of take the book into your own hands, metaphorically speaking, and the baby into your hands, and invite us to events you plan, do your own events, whatever you think is appropriate in your respective communities, and share. Sarah and I are planning to produce a book website. We would be very, very happy to share all that information. We have different endorsements from different colleagues, from Jean-Paul Lederach, from Anita Ernsthofer. We will have other endorsements, which I keep a little bit as a surprise. So they will be all found on that website. So, and if you're planning events, feel free to share the information with us, and Sarah and I will put it up on the website.
We're coming to our last few minutes. There was one, in this vein, one more thing that I wanted to share, which is that there's a lot of excellent and related work going on in parallel by various organizations and practitioners, represented in the volume and not represented in the volume. There was only so much that we could do with this particular publication. And of course, this is a rapidly evolving field. And we want to really use this launch event as an occasion, first of all, to celebrate our own wonderful authors who themselves went through a whole process to communicate in this format the rich and deep work that they're doing in the field. That's itself, I think, was a deep reflection and sometimes a challenge, and also an opportunity for inner and for institutional reflection, but also to recognize that there are many points of connection now in many spaces into which we can take this work and to connect with others who are also working in this area. So Cordula and I encourage everyone here to engage in the conversation, reaching out to the authors of the book, creating opportunities to collaborate on panel discussions or conferences or even projects, sharing with one another your learning in the field, encouraging others to take up these messages and these tools, and to try to continue expanding and growing the field, particularly in the longer term aspects of intergenerational and collective trauma. That's a frontier that the HDP, humanitarian development, peace-building communities are still approaching. I think it's still a new area for exploration. Dagmar, I see a comment from you. Would you like to take the floor?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. I just came across the thought. Did you actually reflect on the idea to invite people rather than buying the book individual or institutionally to just pay the same amount into the crowdfunding campaign so that it becomes open access quicker? Because that would be, if I'm not miscalculating, about 50 books that would need to be bought, right?
Yes. Yes. So you see, one of our wonderful, amazing authors, namely Jenny, was very gently nodding when you said that, because that was already Jenny's idea, exactly what you said. And we definitely will also look into that because we think it's a brilliant idea, and we just need organizations basically willing to do that and to walk the talk. Thank you, Dagmar. Any other questions, ideas, creative ideas which we haven't maybe thought about in terms of marketing?
Connections to the work that you're doing as well, if there's something that you'd like to share, Eva?
I just want to say thank you for the initiative of creating this handbook. I think it's like a stamp in the sand. Even if we're working on moving sand, I just think for myself, in terms of what I've written 2 years, when I started writing it 2 years ago, and the work that we've been doing since then, like moving from this like trauma informed to trauma responsive, and hopefully getting to trauma transformative. And I know that that's how we started discussing it when you both actually coined the terms. And I think it's really, really important to acknowledge it and to see how all of us, it's a collective effort to really more than weaponize the trauma has been either ignored or weaponized. And now we need to find a fine balance of where we're not ignoring it, but we're not also giving it too much importance that it frees us in our action. And that's what has been happening in Palestine, Israel. And so I feel like just being within that container had helped really evolve the conversation. And so I just want to say thank you, and looking forward for part B, maybe not published with Routledge, but really evolving into like where do we take it from here? And part of it is actually, of course, the event that we can organize as the author, but I think also just practical training and facilitation of like, how do you actually deal with trauma? And I know as Peace Activation, we get a lot of requests from people in the field. I just got a request from people in Palestine saying like, we need more trauma responsive people. We need more psychologists. We need people that understand both the whole spectrum, because most of the time we have either psychologist or peace builder or political activist or advocate. And how do we get them really together in speaking in one voice? And that's basically what I've been attempting to do, is like bringing peace activation where it hosts the variety of approaches, because it's not just like, it's not, trauma is not psychological, it's like personal, it's political, it's transgenerational, it's collective. It's like, how can we bring the collective knowledge and connect between the dots? Because I think that's the key to trauma is separation and isolation, and that's what creates war and conflict. And so how can we connect together and work together as one hand in really turning this trauma into stewardship and using it as a platform to like move toward transformation and not get stuck in the weaponizing of it. So thank you both for the initial idea and for stewarding us into this handbook and beyond.
Yes, I would like to add to that as well. In 2008, I foolishly birthed the book on my own, and it was quite a process. And I know that you went through it as well, and I thank you for this. And in terms of bringing people together, I think that's absolutely essential to do. Some of us are working, as SARA knows, from last year, Arts and Peace Encounters in Switzerland. There was a conference in May. And we, last year, spent time trying to integrate the concept of trauma awareness into that conference as well. So the arts, peace building, trauma, the whole nexus is quite important. And thanks to all the authors. I mean, I know it's hard work and I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Well, our thanks, especially to all of you who came today. My deep thanks to Cordula and to all of our authors. Cordula and I have been on quite a journey, the two of us. The volume, of course, is only possible because of everybody who contributed to it. But I really want to give a deep, deep, heartfelt thanks to Cordula for being the most wonderful partner in this challenge and this adventure. It would not have been possible, certainly from my side, without the energy and the dedication and the fire and the passion and the vision that she brought to the process. And we, I feel, learned so much from each other and learned so much from each of you. Accompanying each of the chapters was both an education and a meditation for all of us. And we hope also that we were able to help you share your gems and insights in a way that now the world will be able to pay more attention to the important work that you're doing. So I'll pass back to you, Cordula, and we've come, I think, to the end of our session.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. And I think, Sarah, you said earlier today it was a labor of love. And I think all of us know that love can be sometimes a lot of work, can imply a lot of work. And it's not always easy, but we know this is the way to go. That it sounds maybe a bit slushy, but love in so many ways is the answer, because love comes in different shapes and forms. And I think being connected to the right people in the right time allows connection, allows security, allows stability. So I want to thank again to all of you who actually made the time today and also maybe earlier today for being connected with us, with the authors, with Sarah and myself. And maybe as a way of saying thank you and appreciating the time we spent together, you may all want to unmute yourself and say goodbye in your favorite language, assuming you have a favorite language. Arrivederci.
Bientôt.
Arrivederci. Ciao, ciao.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Arrivederci.
Aloha.
Salame.
Hadura.
Bye.
Khudafis.
Again.
Thank you.
Au revoir.
Thank
Au
you.
revoir.
Arrivederci.
Merci.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.